Thank you. Okay. Well, I was actually going to ask how many of you were here before so I'd know whether I could use the same jokes or not. So I guess it's safe. So in 2 years, knowing my memory, I wouldn't remember jokes anyway. So, well, thank you for having me back. There's so much I could say and talk about today. But actually, I want to first start with the actual practice of mindfulness. And it doesn't matter if you know what that is or not, because it's really something that doesn't require words. I'm just going to invite you, wherever you happen to be sitting at the moment, to maybe set down whatever's in your hands and take a moment to take note of the posture of your body and see if you can find a relatively comfortable posture that's relatively upright, maybe feet planted on the floor. And sitting upright, you don't have to sit rigidly, but at least comfortably upright so that you can breathe comfortably. And you might rest your hands in your lap or at your sides or on the table, whatever is comfortable for you. And if you're willing, actually allowing your eyes to close. And if you'd rather not have your eyes closed, just softening your gaze, maybe directing it downward so that you're not looking at anything in particular, just settling in. Maybe taking a moment to notice the sensations in your body right now, maybe the sensations of the chair and the floor supporting your body, or maybe the touch of clothing, or the cool air moving past the skin. Maybe noticing other sensations in the body, tingling, numbness, pain, tension, heat, whatever's here. Just sort of taking a brief inventory of what sensations are arising in your body in this moment. And perhaps you're noticing breathing happening. Noticing that the breath continues to happen without our conscious intention. The breath moves in and out all by itself. Seeing if you might take some time to just ride on the flow of the breath as it moves in and out. Maybe noticing as the cool air moves in past the nostrils and down into the chest, and how the diaphragm draws the air in and presses it back out as the belly rises and falls. Just following breath after breath. Maybe noticing if your attention drifts or wanders. Maybe you find yourself caught, lost in thought, or preoccupied with a sensation in the body, or maybe a memory, or a thought about something coming up. Maybe an emotion is present. And just each time that you notice that the mind has wandered off, just bringing it back to the breath. Wherever you happen to notice the breath most vividly, it might be at the nostrils or in the chest or at the belly. And simply breathing in and breathing out without having to breathe in any particular way. Simply allowing the breath to breathe itself. And every time that you notice that the mind has drifted or wandered off, you simply bring it back, gently but firmly, like a wayward puppy. Over here, over here. And as you're ready, allowing your eyes to open if they were closed, bringing attention into the room, beginning to be aware of the people around you and the space you're in. So if you came into the room never having meditated before in your life, now you have. Congratulations. It's not too crazy or out there or strange or woo-woo. What did you notice? Would anybody like to share what you noticed as we were going through that practice? What happened for you?
Relaxation.
Relaxation. Was there some place in the body where you really noticed that relaxation in particular?
Probably mind. Or
In mind. Okay.
and actually a whole body.
And the whole body too. Okay. Other observations?
It's really hard for me to turn off my thoughts.
So they kept going, huh?
Yeah,
Same here.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And when you noticed thinking, what did you do with that?
I said, stop thinking.
Okay. How did that work?
It didn't work.
Yeah, not so well.
No offense, that's why I need work.
Yeah, so that mind wandering quality, how many people noticed your mind wandering during that exercise? Okay. And if you didn't raise your hand, that's because your mind was wandering when I asked the question, right? So there's this funny thing about the mind. And this is sort of the first kind of lesson of mindfulness, which is that this is what the mind does, that the mind is active. And there's some kind of good reasons for it, and the mind tends to wander and get distracted easily. And that doesn't seem like a big deal. You know, it's like, okay, so. But that actually has some real implications about our well-being and our happiness and our mood that I'll talk about, and our way of coping. So if you had to guess, in your average day, what % of the time do you think that your mind wanders sort of aimlessly like that? Any guesses? 96 all the time? Okay. 99. Okay, fortunately it's more like about 46.9% of the time. So you're a little pessimistic on the 99%. And there's a very interesting research study around that I think is really illustrates the point here and kind of points to how this is all related to our mood and well-being. So a group of researchers took about 2,500 people, gave them all smartphones, which sounds like a recipe for disaster right there, right? You know, and sent them out into their daily lives and said, we're going to send you text messages at random times throughout the day, and we're going to ask you 3 questions. We're going to ask, what are you doing? No, we're going to ask, what are you doing? Is your attention on what you were doing in this moment, and how happy or satisfied are you feeling? Okay, so they wanted to know what people were doing, whether their attention was actually present on their activity, and then how happy or satisfied they felt. And so they found 3 important points. The first one was the one I mentioned. They found that 46.9% of the time, people's attention was not on whatever activity they were engaged in, okay? So more or less half the time. The second thing that they learned was that it really didn't matter what the activity might be, what the nature of the activity was. It could be pleasant activity, it could be neutral activity, it could be unpleasant activity. The mind wandered about the same, about somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% of the time. There was only one human activity that sort of stood out from all the rest that people reported being much more present for than any other. Sex, exactly. Which for me always raised the question, who were those people answering those text messages? You know, how did that work exactly? So so it didn't seem to matter mostly whether an activity was pleasant or unpleasant. The mind continued to wander. And then the third one is the one that I think is the most relevant. So when they looked at satisfaction, happiness and satisfaction scores, that if you wanted to predict how happy or satisfied somebody was, you were better off looking at how present they were to their activities than the pleasantness of those activities. So in other words, if people were more present, It didn't, it actually predicted happiness, even if they were present to unpleasant activities. So to some extent, it didn't matter if you were walking the dog or picking up the dog poop. It was really whether you were present for that experience. And this is true of life itself, really. It's not always completely obvious. You know, you think, well, why would I want to be present to pain, you know, or sadness, or loss, or, you know, poverty, or whatever I might be facing in life. But the reality is that those things are here, right? You know, that life is got this whole range of activities, the whole range of experiences, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and it is a part of life. You know, I could say we teach mindfulness as a means of stress reduction. So I could say, you want stress reduction? Just make a list of all the things that you don't like in your life, all the things that are stressful, get rid of them. Stress reduction, right? You know, if it was that easy, right, I wouldn't have a job. We know life is like that. It has these activities. So often it has to do with how willing we are to actually be present to what's here when it's here. We will often say, there's a kind of a cute saying that suffering, which is, you know, really the essence of stress, is a result of, it's like a mathematical equation. Suffering equals pain times resistance. So there is the pain, the reality of pain that is here. If you think about physical pain, for example, which many of you don't have to think about, you have it, that there is the physical sensation of pain. And then there is how much we might be resisting, trying to avoid or get away from, or wishing it away, that actually multiplies the impact of it, right? To whatever extent it's possible for you to allow the pain, there's some relief of suffering that happens there. So I will often talk about, you have all had this experience, I'm sure, of having a doctor along, or nurse along the way, ask you to rate your pain. Yeah, I heard a grunt, you know, right? That's always a real popular question, right? Nobody likes answering that question, right? You know, it's their only way of kind of generally assessing the intensity of your experience, but it's a real tough question to answer. But as a psychologist, I worked for 10 years in the pain clinic at UC San Diego and worked with a lot of people with chronic pain. And I actually found the question useful, but in a slightly different way. So that number that a person picks, you know, when you say you're an 8 on the 1 to 10 scale, by itself, it's a general measure of how intense the pain is. But if you look a little bit closer, and you look at it in this way like I'm talking about with this resistance piece, if you look at it, it's usually made up of a certain component of sensation and a certain component of distress. And when we look in the brain at what pain looks like in the brain, it's mirrored there. So that if you give somebody intentional pain and you put them in an fMRI scanner, you will see more or less 3 areas of the brain that light up, that activate. First, the sensory area. You know, if the pain is here in the left forearm, then there's some place in the brain where that registers and that lights up the sensation of pain from that place. But then there are also cognitive areas, in other words, the thoughts you have about that pain that light up. And then there are emotions. So if you have an emotion of fear or anger or frustration that arises, that area lights up. So we know that the experience of pain, and you know this firsthand, most of you, is complex. It's not just a sensation. Right? It's like, oh, this pain is here again, and why is this happening, and why can't they fix it, and all the thoughts you have, and then the emotions of sadness, depression, anxiety, all those kinds of things. It's very complex, right? So nothing necessarily changes. We can't necessarily get rid of that pain, right? I mean, that's part of why there's a group here for this particular condition, because if you could get rid of it, there would be no support group, right? So we can't often do a lot for the sensation. The good news is that that's only part of the equation. The sensation is one piece, but then there is this thinking process, the cognitive process, and the emotional process that can vary from person to person significantly. And if we could cultivate a different relationship with the sensation, that part of the equation drops, and the overall experience of, say, pain reduces. And the same is true for a lot of things, not just pain. You know, things that are difficult in your life that you face, you know, a relationship or a, you know, as mundane as a, you know, a broken light fixture or a, you know, a child that isn't doing what you want them to do. There is the reality, and then there's the thinking and the emotion that comes with it. And if we cultivate a different relationship with it, we reduce our level of suffering. So it's all very kind of theoretical sounding, but it has real implications. So there's a guy whose name is Dr. John Kabat-Zinn. He was a molecular biologist at MIT, so naturally he went on to teach meditation. You know, it's a normal career path, right? Who was a yoga practitioner for many years, and back in the early 70s had studied Eastern religions, Buddhism, and practiced yoga, as I said, and meditation. And he had his PhD from MIT, and he went to work in the labs at the University of Massachusetts in Worcester, Massachusetts. And he was really intrigued by this practice of mindfulness, of meditation and yoga, and how it's intended to relieve suffering in the world. It has been for centuries, in really a lot of different traditions, but especially Eastern traditions. And he was working at UMass in the medical center, so he was working within a hospital. And he said, you know, here, I know this work of relieving suffering, of meditation and yoga, and I know that this has been helpful for people for many, many years in a kind of spiritual context. But here I am in a hospital. It's a suffering magnet. You know, this is what suffering is what draws people into this hospital. Is there some way that maybe I could teach this practice to people who are struggling and suffering now so that they could relieve that suffering? And he was particularly intrigued by people with chronic pain. Actually, that was where he first started. Because these are people, as you know, that you know, are given some forms of treatment or whatever, and think back, you know, 40 years now. Many people being told, you're just going to have to live with it, right? You know that line. You've heard it. And so his idea was, yes, instead of saying you just have to live with it, what if you just could say, you have to live with it, so what could you do? Could you possibly cultivate a different relationship with this pain that might give you some relief, that might turn your 8 from an 8 to a 6, or a 6 to a 2, or whatever it might be? Could you reduce the suffering and get it down to just the sensation? Or if you could reduce the distress. So it was really a revolutionary idea to sort of take a kind of what seemed to be an esoteric kind of Eastern philosophy, spiritual practice, and consider applying it or teaching it to people in the West to contend with stress, pain, and illness. Turns out it was a really good idea. He developed a program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. I can't spend a lot of time on that, but it's a very widely researched program. It's a course in mindfulness. I still haven't defined what mindfulness is, so I probably should do that. But it's an 8-week-long course that incorporates meditation and other meditative practices to help people cultivate a different relationship with stress, pain, and illness. So mindfulness, I'm going to go back to that. So my shortest definition of mindfulness is moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness. Basically, that's it. So it sounds pretty simple, and it actually is fairly simple. So moment to moment, we'll just break it down a little bit. So when we say moment to moment, you know, it's not just a bumper sticker or a poster. We only have moments to live. This one right here is the only one we've got. We have had many moments in the past, presumably, and hopefully we'll have many moments in the future, but we aren't there. We aren't in the past, we aren't in the future, we're here. So you could say, well, duh, that's kind of obvious. But the tricky part is we have an amazing human brains that are really super capable of going back into the past and off into the future and out into other places. And as I said, as we've talked about, the mind wanders, right? So guaranteed, while you are all sitting here, every one of us left the room. right? Somewhere along the way, we had a random thought, oh, I have to do this thing tonight, or, oh, I was just remembering my grandmother, or that person over there looks like my sister. I wonder how my sister's doing. What am I having for dinner? And then, it's 10 minutes later, and all you've heard up here is wah, 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 That's what happens, right? So, and it's good that our brains can do that because we can plan, we can organize, we can use these frontal lobes of our brain to play through scenarios and to consider possibilities and anticipate problems and challenges. It's wonderful that we have this. This is what makes us human. But often our mind wanders off and does that stuff when we really ought to be paying attention, like when we ought to be watching for the exit on the freeway, or checking to see when the pot's boiling or whatever it may be. And it's great and wonderful many times to go back into the past and to reminisce about wonderful things or to learn from past experiences for future. But sometimes just lingering in the past doesn't serve us very well. If we have pain in the present, we have difficulty in the present, and all we can do is think about the days before when we didn't have it, we make ourselves even more miserable, right? I mean, it's not to say you can't think about those things, but that happens, right? You could be sitting there and sort of saying, oh boy, my back is really sore. I just came back from a vacation. Not that I'm complaining, but I did spend 14 hours on an airplane, and my back was sore, So you could notice that your back is sore, and then if you think, oh, remember the days when my back wasn't sore? That was so nice, why didn't I appreciate that? And, oh, this is really bad. This is miserable that I have this pain. And you can kind of work yourself up, and that's a very benign example. So we have these brains that can go off in the future and go back in the past. But what if, and then we're missing the moment, right? And we all know the benefits of being present to our lives, not missing the grandchild's first steps or the look in the eyes of your beloved or whatever it may be. We all kind of get that. But as I highlighted earlier, there is benefit to being present to all of it. So you could say, well, I'm pretty present to everything, but as I said, the mind wanders a lot. And what we've learned is that through this practice of mindfulness, moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness, and I realize I didn't finish the definition, but we can actually experience more of the moments if we can train the brain to come back into the present moment. So, sorry to depart a little bit. So moment-to-moment is that can we actually bring ourselves into each moment so we can live fully in that moment, If you've ever been, the best example is if you've ever been to a doctor's appointment when you knew your doctor was distracted or preoccupied. That feeling, you've had it with other people that like when you're with them, but they're not really with you, right? I have a 22-year-old son, and I talk to, you can do it over the phone, right? I'll be talking to him, and we'll be going back and forth, and then all of a sudden I have this sense of like, hello, is anybody there? He's gone off, and he comes back. So we know that, right? So what if we could be as more fully present to every single moment? Because that happiness and satisfaction is actually more likely to happen if we're present, even if what we're present for is unpleasant. So moment to moment, non-judgmental. So that's a tricky one. Sometimes people hear non-judgmental and they think mindfulness or meditation is like passivity. Like when you say don't be judgmental, that means that everything's okay. That you should put up with everything, you should be passive. People are mean to you, people abuse you, people mistreat you, whatever it may be. It's just okay, it's all, this is it. I just have to put up with it. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is exercising judgment, because that's, again, what these human brains do. But there are times when judgment actually causes us suffering. And like I said, if you have that pain in your back and then you think, oh, this is bad pain, this is a terrible pain, this is not what I wanted, why can't I have the other? Then we actually add to it by adding judgment to the piece. So my favorite example of that to think about is think about whether you have judgment about gravity. Think about the last time you even thought about gravity, right? So if you think about it, gravity exerts a negative influence in our lives at times, right? If you take your cup and you nudge it over the edge of the table, it falls, it spills, it's a mess, you have to clean it up. That's a bad thing, right? You take a look in the mirror, things aren't quite where they used to be, you know, again, kind of that negative influence of gravity. But how many of us wake up in the morning and get up off the, you know, out of bed and we say, oh, damn, I'm still stuck to the earth. Right? We don't wrestle with that. You know, we don't judge it as sort of like some kind of bad thing that we have to deal with. We just accept the reality of it. So what if you could have the same attitude you have towards gravity with whatever life deals you, even when it's unpleasant? It doesn't mean you give up on trying to fix it or improve it, but what if in this moment, if you know, we talk about acceptance, and that's a very charged word, but it could be, could I accept that things are as they are in this very moment? Because how else could they be, right? Could you let go of the struggle with what actually is? So this is a very simple idea, and probably a lot of you are nodding your heads. It probably makes a certain amount of sense. It's a very simple idea. It's a very hard practice, right? Because you can say, oh yeah, I should be in the moment and let go of judgment, and the next thing you know, you're thinking, God, is this guy ever going to shut up? And I really wish I'd gone to this other thing, and you know, blah, blah, blah. It happens, and you can always bring yourself back. So judgment contributes to our suffering. Judging, evaluating things, especially judging something as terrible if it's something that you also just have. So moment-to-moment non-judgmental awareness. Awareness is just the foundation on which all of this rests. When we're actually aware, then we notice when we're judging, when we're resisting, when we're in the past, in the future. So this is what we're cultivating with this practice of mindfulness, is cultivating a sort of more well-behaved brain, is one way to think about it. So one of the great discoveries of the past couple of decades has been that we actually can change the brain. We actually, you know, used to, probably all of you, including me, when I was growing up, what I learned was like, you know, you got this many neurons, this is all you're getting. When you've kind of like, when things have wired together in a certain way in your brain, you're stuck with it. It's going to be like this forever. So now we actually know that the brain can change over time through repeated practice. There are really interesting studies of the, someone did an imaging study of cab drivers in London. I think it was maybe 20 some years ago, looking at the activity of their brains, and the area of the brain that has to do with sort of navigation and location and things like that was super well developed in these cabbies because they were using it constantly. It's just like a muscle. So we can change the pathways of the brain. We can actually train the brain to wander less and be present more. That's heartening to me, to change those pathways. If you suddenly don't have to say, well, I'm just an anxious person, I'm always going to be anxious. You can actually cultivate pathways that make you less anxious over time, more present, as I said. And that's really where the mindfulness practice comes from. So we teach mindfulness in the form of meditation. Sometimes people hear mindfulness meditation and what's the difference. So what we did at the beginning, before I rang the bells, was meditation. It was a particular type of meditation that we would call mindfulness, but it was a practice that was intended to cultivate mindfulness, this presence, this moment-to-moment non-judgmental awareness that actually leads to reduced stress. So I want to shift topics in a second to self-compassion, but I want to say one more thing. So there's a huge body of research now growing rapidly around mindfulness practice and how it can help people cope with stress, pain, and illness. There's tons of studies that just show people reporting less pain, less anxiety, less depression, better quality of life, things like that. Very kind of self-report type studies. But now there are also studies of the brain showing these changes that happen in the brain from before the 8-week MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction course, to after, changes in the immune system. With a lot of mindfulness practice, literal physical changes happen in the brain in terms of thickness of certain areas of the cortex. There's a lot of cool research going on. There's actually, we have a researcher coming to work with us at UCSD in November who's going to be working in our center, who's been doing work around pain and mindfulness, and he's done some really groundbreaking studies that says that suggest, among other things, that people who are more mindful tend to experience less pain intensity from the same stimulus. So there is something about mindfulness that actually kind of modifies the experience of physical pain. So we're excited to have him coming. So it's not an easy practice to learn. Like I said, I could just say, moment-to-moment non-judgmental awareness, go do that and you'll be fine. And you could say, okay, but it'll be tricky, right? There are a lot of, probably too many books on mindfulness out there. There's this course, MBSR, Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. We teach it at UCSD, but it's also taught at Scripps. It used to be taught at Sharp. I'm not sure if they're still teaching it there. In the community, you can Google MBSR and you'll find a course. It's an 8-week-long course. And the course is amazing. I've been teaching it for 20 years. It kind of brings in this practice of meditation, mindful movement or yoga, and mindful walking, and some other practices. You practice a lot. We ask you to come to class every week, but also to do these practices at home every day for periods of time. Because, you know, if we're going to change the brain, if we're going to change our habits, you know it takes some time and commitment. You can't take a pill. There's no short course. You just have to do it. So I could talk for hours about that. I'm not going to. But what I wanted to do was to shift a little bit and to focus a little bit on one thing that happens when we begin to be more mindful and more aware of what's going on in our body, in our brain, in our hearts. We start to notice, among other things, that there's a bit of an epidemic, and maybe this is why Martha said what she did. There's a bit of an epidemic of self-criticism in the world and a lack of compassion, both for others and for ourselves. We're often more obviously aware of the lack of compassion towards others in the world. We are acutely aware of a lot of that right now. We don't need to go there, but we can talk about what happens inside here. So, anybody here familiar with self-criticism? Anybody? Yeah, a couple of people. Maybe once you noticed a little voice that was self-critical. Or sometimes it's just once every 10 seconds or 5 seconds, right? I'm going to ask you to, I'm going to kind of guide you through just a little reflection here. Because self-compassion and the lack of it has a very big impact on our well-being as well, and that's where I wanted to focus the rest of our time. So if you just stop and think for a moment, think about the various times when you've had a dear friend who suffered, maybe had a misfortune, they failed, they were feeling inadequate in some way. How do you typically respond to your friends in those situations, to that friend? You know, what are the things, just think to yourself, what do you say? What's the tone of voice that you tend to use with someone who's, you know, they've just had a hard time, they've just fallen short, they've failed at something, they're really feeling bad about themselves. So, you know, what do you say? What's the tone? What things might you do? Maybe you give them a hug, or you make them a cup of tea, or you pat them on the back, or, you know, whatever else it may be. Just think about that for a second, about how you treat a friend when they have a hard time. So, now think about a different scenario. Think about the times when you were suffering in some way. When you fell short, when you failed, when you were feeling inadequate, when something didn't go well for you. How do you typically respond to yourself? Again, what are the things you say to yourself? And the tone, what's the tone that you use with yourself? Sometimes it's all in the tone. And what are the things maybe that you do when these situations happen? They inevitably happen in every life. How do you treat yourself? So when you think about it like that, first of all, how many of you noticed a difference between how you treat a friend and how you treat yourself? Okay, okay. How many of you found it to be about the same? Okay. So I'd be willing to guess that those of you who noticed a difference found that you treat your friend more kindly than you treat yourself. Am I accurate about that?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody treat yourself nicer than you treat others? It does happen. There's actually some interesting research that says that one of the foremost researcher in the field of self-compassion, his name is Kristin Neff. In your handout packet, there's a bunch of research articles in the back and references to books and things, and hers is one of the books, a couple of them. But she did some research on this issue about are people kinder to themselves or to others, and she found that 78% of the general population, at least in the US, are more compassionate to others than they are to themselves. So if you're there, you're in good company. 6% are more compassionate to themselves than others, and about 16% are about equal. But really, what I'm interested in is that differential when people are kinder to others than they are to themselves. That doesn't seem right when you really think about it, does it? I mean, you know, there's some reasons it happens, we'll talk about that, but it's kind of unfortunate, you know? So, you know, like your friend takes the California bar exam and fails and is just miserable because they failed, and you're like, oh, you'll get them next time, I know you can do this, and you poor thing, this must be tough, and let me get you a cup of tea or whatever. Very compassionate, right? We can pull that off. And then somehow when we fail the California bar exam, we're like, I'm such an idiot. I didn't study enough. This, you know, what's wrong with me? I should have never gone to law school in the first place, right? You know, beat yourself up in all these different ways. So there is an epidemic of this. I mean, this is happening in the world. And not only is there just an imbalance, but often that critical voice that says those things like, you're no good, you're not smart enough, you should have never done this, et cetera, can be super, super harsh and can really lead to a lot of problems, depression, anxiety, those sorts of things. And maybe people in here have experienced things like that. So really what self-compassion is learning to treat ourselves the way we would treat a good friend when we suffer, fall short, or fail. That's really the simplest definition of self-compassion. Could we possibly just treat ourselves like human beings, you know, like someone worthy of compassion rather than someone who's flawed and weak and stupid and all of the rest? It's a simple idea, right? But there are a lot of reasons why we end up being very self-critical that we can talk about. So first thing, it's probably helpful to kind of break down compassion just a little bit and self-compassion to kind of understand that it actually has some parts to it. A lot of us have heard a lot of talk about self-esteem. It was a super big deal, especially in the US and especially in California for many years. It was all about self-esteem for kids. You know, it seemed like kids who had higher self-esteem tended to achieve more and have more success. That turned out to be really only partially true and a real kind of red herring in a way, because self-esteem is really believing in yourself, but believing that you are good, that you are above average. Okay, so there's a bit of a flaw with that. If everybody believes they're above average, you know, you don't have to be a statistics major to know that that doesn't actually happen, that you can't have the whole population be above average because, you know, right? It's, there's actually a study of people, people tend to estimate and assume that they are above average at a lot of things. So there's actually studies that surveyed thousands and thousands of people asking them about essentially how good of a driver do you think you are? And in general, they found that I think people generally rated that all people, you know, something like 80 to 85% of people rated their driving skills as above average, which of course can't actually be true. So we have So self-esteem is about sort of holding yourself up as essentially being better than others in a way. It's like your success depends upon being better than others in a lot of ways. And it's a whole big conversation that I don't want to go into too much. But really, self-esteem is conditional on success. You know, it's really hard to sort of tell yourself you're above average when you fail, right? Self-compassion, on the other hand, is not contingent upon anything. We can always love ourselves. We can always, just like compassion, we can always be kind to people even when they're jerks, right? We can always be kind to ourselves even when we fail and fall short. So it's not contingent, and this is what kind of persists. And so the self-esteem movement was kind of a little bit off base, even though the intention was good. Self-esteem is related to self-compassion. People who are more self-compassionate tend to have greater self-esteem, but what's powerful is the self-compassion. So if you think about just for a second, just to, again, to define self-compassion just a bit. If you think about compassion for others, really self-compassion, compassion for others is really, self-compassion is really just compassion directed inward. So, but just for a moment, if you think about compassion for others. So let's just say you're walking down the street in San Diego and you come upon a homeless woman and she's clearly suffering. She's really having a hard time. She doesn't look well. She looks unhappy. She looks hungry, dirty, whatever. What, if you think about it, what would have to arise, what would have to happen for you to feel compassion for that person? Any ideas about what would have to arise within you for you to have compassion for that person?
Put yourself in their place, and that could be me. You know?
Yeah, exactly. So one part is that this common humanity, that this is another human being, just like me. Okay, so that's one piece of it. There's something that has to happen even before that.
Well, one thing that I think of is the small margin between where you are and where they are, and how you could end up there pretty quickly.
Right.
A few things could happen.
Exactly. Sort of.
You failed to do or did do certain things.
Right. Sort of like the there, but for the grace of God, go I kind of thing, or some little thing could change. Yeah, and that's kind of part of that common humanity piece. Yeah.
No, I was just,
Oh,
I
you're.
couldn't hear.
Oh, okay. Did I make that clear enough? What I just said? Good. Inadvertently. So one of the components is kind of so obvious we often overlook it, which is exactly that. Like, you'd have to notice her, right? Before compassion could arise in your heart, you would have to actually see her, right? I recall one time driving somewhere, North Park, I think, with my son, who was 9 or 10 at the time. We were going to school. We stopped, pulled up to a stoplight, and you know, I'm just sitting there waiting for the light to change, and he's digging around in his pocket, and he pulls out $1, and he says, "Let's give it to that guy." There was a man standing there, you know, as we see all over, you know, asking for money. I literally had not, he was like right there, I had not seen him. So you have to notice. So that's the mindfulness piece, right? That in order for us to have compassion for someone, first we have to even notice that there is someone there, right? And then noticing that this is another human being who, just like me, you know, struggles, suffers, has joys and sorrows, all of the rest. And then the third component would be exactly what my son was doing, which is to want to relieve that suffering, to want to bring some kindness. So you can notice somebody, see that they're suffering, but there's no compassion until you actually have a desire to relieve that suffering, right? It doesn't mean you can always do something about it, but you at least tap into that, oh, you know, like, oh, that's hard. Like, could I do something, you know, is there something I can do? I'm not sure there is. I could make eye contact. I could smile, whatever it be, right? These are the three components of compassion, and then the three components of self-compassion. That we have to notice our own suffering. That's the mindfulness in self-compassion. Because quite often, honestly, we're not very aware of our own suffering. We have to recognize that when we suffer, it is part of the human condition, that we all suffer. Every single person in this room suffers. I'm presuming everyone in this room is human. You all appear to be human, as far as I can tell, right? It's a part of the human condition that we suffer, that we fail. right? So you know when you fail, you feel like this is just you. You know, you are the only one who has had this unique experience, but you really know at another level that it happens. Many people fail the California bar exam, or, you know, whatever, or their kids don't meet their expectations, or whatever it may be. So just recognizing that common bond of humanity is actually a part of the compassion process. And then kindness. So in the compassion for others, it's about what could I do to relieve that person's suffering. In self-compassion, it's what could I do to meet my own suffering? Could I actually be kind to myself? So I'm actually going to invite you, if you're comfortable with it, to stand up. If you'd rather not stand, that's okay. This can be done sitting down, but you have been sitting for a long time and you probably need a little break. Stretch the body. I've been standing, so I feel like I should sit down, but I won't. So, and when you're ready, and only do this to whatever extent is possible for you. It's not mandatory. There won't be a test at the end. We won't not let you out unless you pass your test. And no gold stars or anything like that. But if you take your hands like this and you form some fists, and might even close your eyes for a moment and squeeze those fists as tightly as you feel comfortable squeezing. And if you could, just call out the sort of feeling of this gesture. What's a feeling that's associated with this for you? A feeling or emotion? Tension.
Fear.
I'm sorry?
Fear.
Fear.
Pain.
Pain.
Frustration.
Any others? So holding sometimes, resisting, fighting. So this is the feeling or a gesture associated with the feeling of self-criticism. This is how we feel when we beat ourselves up, the physical manifestation of that. And so then if you open up your hands, and you can open your eyes for a moment if you want to see what I'm doing here, and just opening the palms, just releasing and opening them palms up, and just taking a moment to feel what this feels like. And what comes up here? What is the feeling tone with this gesture? Relief. Release. Surrender. Open.
Peace.
Peace.
Accepting.
Accepting. So this is a gesture that kind of corresponds, or feeling that corresponds with mindfulness, of that open, moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness. And then if you extend the arms out just a little bit, just kind of forward and around, just take a moment to notice any subtle difference here, and what do you notice when you do this? Stretch. Reaching out. Embracing. So this is a felt sense of that common humanity. This is the way we reach out to hold someone, or the way we reach up to be picked up by someone. So this is the gesture of common humanity. And then if you take one hand open and place it over the heart, on the chest, and then the other hand on top of that, just feeling the warmth and tenderness of the touch. And what comes with this? Peace, love. So this is the gesture that captures self-kindness, that other component of compassion. Just this kind, warm touch. So you can go ahead and have a seat if you like. We actually know that the practice of self-compassion or self-kindness, like you just did with placing your hands on your heart, as you could tell, it has a physiological effect, right? You could feel it physically in your body, translated to a concept or an idea of self-kindness. But self-compassion kind of, when we're stressed out, we're often in the fight or flight mode. We call it sympathetic arousal. You've heard of fight or flight, right?
Yeah.
So that's one system that's intended to keep us from getting eaten. You know, we've sort of evolved that system over the generations so that when we were attacked, we could get away. The problem is that system, that stress symptom, that system, the fight or flight, that used to be intended for keeping us from getting eaten is eating us these days, right? But we have another system. We have a mammalian caregiving system. That we have oxytocin and other hormones the kind of tend and befriend system is another way we talk about it. Because we're humans, we know, if you're a turtle, this is something you probably haven't thought about lately, and you're a babe, you're inside the, you see those National Geographic videos, right, of the little turtles hatching out of the eggs in the sand. You come up out of your little egg, and then you make yourself your way out in the water, and you're basically like on your own. I mean, to a large part, because amphibians are a little different species than humans. And much of the animal kingdom, the babies don't really need much tending. We, on the other hand, have kids that need us for a long, sometimes really long time, right? Which means that we have to be connected. We have to be sort of wired to them. We can't be hardwired to them. We can't have these cables, but we are wired to them in other ways, neurochemically, to stay connected to them and for them to be connected to us. We have this connection, this bond with our children. Our children have the bond with us because they need us for survival, right? So we are all wired to have this tend and befriend system to draw us towards our loved ones, towards our offspring, and for them to be drawn to us. We need each other. And that's how we normally kind of can comfort ourselves and soothe ourselves. And we are drawn to each other, and we are drawn to each other as human beings because we need each other. This is why common humanity is so powerful. Because we do need each other. We are part of one big tribe. We forget that sometimes, and we often can feel really isolated, but we are actually connected. And that's not just sort of a woo-woo Southern California thing. We are really wired together for survival. So one thing that happens is that when that bond gets broken, when that trust gets violated, whether it is that someone is, sorry to bring this up, but being pulled away from one's parent at a tender age. But if a parent abuses a child or mistreats them in some way, or they're injured in some way, that bond gets broken, and that natural tendency to be connected to others gets broken. It leads down a path of a lot of problems without getting too complex into that. But my point of it is that self-compassion actually kicks in that tend and befriend system towards ourselves, which is maybe something that we're not in the habit of doing. Like I said, like a lot of you shared, you're not as kind to yourself as you are to others. But you can change that. You can actually tend to your own struggles and sufferings in the way in which you would tend to other people's. So the interesting thing is the research shows very strongly that people who are more self-compassionate really do better in the world in a whole variety of ways. We are actually to the point in the scientific world that scientific journals, I've actually had colleagues who have gotten feedback from editors at a scientific journal when they've submitted a study showing that self-compassion is related to some positive quality. You could pick anything. The editors are saying, what, this isn't news anymore. This is established, self-compassion is related to all of these good things, mood, quality of life, satisfaction, all these different things. We're not interested in hearing about that. We want to go further with the research now and understand why that is and how we can teach that and that sort of thing. So the research is quite strong that self-compassion is related to a lot of great things. And so the question would become, maybe we could cultivate self-compassion in the same way that we cultivate mindfulness. And so Kristin Neff, who I mentioned earlier, and her colleague, Christopher Germer, Chris is a clinical psychologist and an expert in mindfulness and compassion in psychotherapy. They got together and they designed this program called Mindful Self-Compassion that's intended to teach people to practice self-compassion, to become more compassionate, to learn to treat themselves the way they treat other people. And it's an amazing program. I'm a little biased because I teach the program, I train teachers of it, and as Martha mentioned, I run the nonprofit Center for Mindful Self-Compassion, so you would hope that I would be, you know, in favor of this program. But it really does some remarkable things for people. But I want to say a little something about misgivings about self-compassion. So you might be sitting there, like if you said, you know, that sounds really good. I think I'd like to take a mindful self-compassion course. You can take one at UCSD, by the way. This wasn't intended to be a commercial, but if you look up the Center for Mindfulness at UCSD, you can find the MSc course. But that's not why I'm here. You might think to yourself, I'm going to take a self-compassion class. I'm just too hard on myself. I have this inner critic that's just horrendous. I want to be more self-compassionate. And then maybe there'd be another side of you that would have a hesitation about that. Or maybe if you told a friend, hey, I'm taking a self-compassion class, if you were willing to tell a friend that, you know, you might get a funny look from them. You know, what would be the kinds of misgivings or hesitations that people might have about being more self-compassionate? Maybe doubts you have about being more self-compassionate. Any thoughts? Right, so maybe this seems sort of narcissistic or self-centered, you know, yeah.
That you can't, that you really don't deserve it. That's the feeling a lot of times.
Exactly, that's what keeps a lot of people out of the classes, right? Feeling like, well, I don't deserve this, right? It's a kind of a paradox that the people who need it most maybe are holding back because they feel like they don't deserve it. Other thoughts about self-compassion, yeah?
Or seen as broken.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So that's why you don't really tell people you're taking a self-compassion class. You want to appear that there's something wrong with you. Yeah?
Is there a difference between men and women on how they treat themselves?
There's not a huge difference that I recall in the research between men and women and how self-critical they are. Actually, I was going to say one versus the other, and now I really don't think. I think it's about the same. What is really different is how many men come to a mindful self-compassion class. It's tiny. Like, yeah, if we get 10% men in there, that's a really big deal. Yeah, exactly. So if you're a guy and you're looking to meet women, you could come to the mindful self-compassion class. Good chance you'll meet some. But there are also some interesting things about men and self-compassion that it's a particular interest of mine that I want to come back to in a second. So I heard some of these things. Sometimes people think, well, sounds kind of self-indulgent. Guys often, although this isn't just true of guys, but often will say, well, you know, I'll lose my edge. You know, I've gotten where I've gotten, I've climbed the corporate ladder, I've done this, I've made it through medical school because I beat myself up at every turn, and that's how I was able to get where I am today. Or people will think it's a form of making excuses, or that it's weakness. That kind of goes with that showing that you're broken or that you have a problem. People feel like that it's weak to be kind and warm to yourself. You know, it's kind of girly if you're a man, you know, that sort of thing. And actually, the interesting thing is that in every one of those cases, the research points exactly in the opposite direction. So for example, weakness. There are actually some pretty good studies that show self-compassionate people are better able to cope with difficulties like combat trauma, divorce, and chronic pain. So actually, it's really the opposite. We actually talk about it as a form of resilience to be self-compassionate. Actually, people who are self-compassionate tend to be more caring and concerned about other people, largely because they can be in touch with their own suffering and struggling. So it's not really selfish or self-indulgent. It's actually just the opposite. Self-indulgent is a good example. Also, is that people will think, well, you know, so self-compassion is just like giving yourself what you want whenever you want it. You know, like I can eat that whole pint of Ben & Jerry's, Cherries Garcia, that's my favorite. You know, because that's self-compassionate. You know, I'm practicing self-compassion as I eat a whole pint of ice cream, you know. But in the end, that's self-indulgent, right? And if you, it's easiest to kind of understand that as a parent. Most of you are probably parents. That if your kid said, you know, I want ice cream for breakfast, you know, you probably rarely, if ever, would have said yes to that, right? Not because you are not a compassionate person, but because that's not in the best interest of that child. And the same is true for yourself. So the self-compassionate approach may be to not have ice cream for breakfast, to eat something healthy for breakfast. And the same is true with the compassion. So it's not really this sort of self-indulgence, like you just do what feels good, you do what is good. And sometimes that doesn't always feel good or pleasant or whatever. There's something that we talk about that's called fierce compassion. The idea that maybe, you know, if someone is being hurt by another person, compassion is not just saying, oh, it's all fine, it's okay. Sometimes, like, compassion is getting in there and saying, no, this is not right. That's the compassionate thing. And it's the same thing for yourself. Standing up for yourself. If you're being mistreated, compassion is not just being kind and just opening up and continuing to take it. Sometimes compassion is firm. So we even say that compassion, self-compassion, has kind of a stereotypically masculine and feminine side, a yin and a yang side. So the yin side is more about protecting, is more about comforting, soothing, nurturing. That's the part that usually comes to mind when we say self-compassion. You know, so it's sort of intuitively obvious, but the other side of it, the yang side of it, the more masculine side, is that protecting and providing and motivating are also part of self-compassion. These are more, like I said, stereotypically male. Yeah, masculine.
Physical pain is physical. I cannot imagine that self-compassion, being self-compassion, helps any physical pain, you know.
Right, and that's why what I was talking about earlier is that when we say physical pain, it's really rarely only physical. It's not, it's usually physical along with an emotional component of like fear, sadness, anxiety, a thought component of this is bad, terrible, it's going to change my life, whatever. It's a complex kind of cloud of experience. So what's happening with self-compassion or mindfulness is sort of dealing with the cloud around the sensation of pain. So that you could, in terms of self-compassion, in a moment of, say, a flare-up of pain, might it be possible for you to be kind to yourself because you're having the pain? Not to get rid of the pain, but because it's happening. Just like, is this your husband sitting here with you?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm guessing he looks like a heartful guy, so that maybe if you're having a particularly hard time and he's there with you, you know, maybe giving you a hug or just, you know, letting you know he cares and he's there. You know, he's not getting rid of your pain, but he is treating you with kindness, which makes it sort of more bearable. So we often say we give ourselves compassion not to feel better, but because we feel bad. So the example is kind of similar to this, is that when your child has the flu, right, and you bring them a cold compress or some hot soup or whatever, you're not treating the flu. You know, you're not going to cure the flu with a cold compress. You've accepted the fact that they're having the flu and it's going to run its course, but you can comfort them and soothe them in the midst of it. And that's the part that often gets lost when we're struggling and suffering, is we forget that we could actually just be kind to ourselves because we're having this. You know, the sound of self-compassion is something like, "Aww," right? You know, let's all do that. "Aww," right? Yeah, so you can feel it physiologically, right? And then there's also kind of a light feeling too that comes with it that's more like, "Ah," when we can let go of needing it to be any different. So I kind of got a little off track there, but there is that active and the more nurturing side of compassion. So back to those misgivings, because I wanted to touch on a couple others, especially the one, you know, I'll lose my edge. You know, if I'm not tough on myself, you know, especially like I said, guys get this a lot, you know, you think about any of you that ever played sports, man or woman, if you think about the best coach you ever had, or maybe the best coach your kids ever had in Little League or soccer or whatever, usually they were somebody who motivated the kids, or motivated you, who had high standards, wanted them to do well, pushed them hard, and when they fell short or failed, they still supported them. They still urged them on. We'll get them next time. Let's take a look at the tapes. Let's review. You know, I want you to do better because you want to do better. And didn't berate them or you. You know, didn't be, oh, you're such an idiot. How could you have done this, blah, 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 you know? So what we actually know is that people who are more self-compassionate actually tend to try harder and achieve more than people who are not self-compassionate. For the very reason that's probably kind of obvious, is because when the people fall short, if you're not self-compassionate, if you're super self-critical, you beat yourself up. And nobody wants to go through that. So like athletes and people like that who are too self-critical don't really tend to succeed because they can't tolerate it when they fail, and everybody fails. Make some sense? It's not easy just because it makes sense, I know. So just stop being so self-critical. We come by self-criticism honestly, right? We didn't choose to be self-critical, right? That little voice in your head that kind of goes, that gives that commentary. Anybody have that voice? Not one of those crazy voices, just the, you know. Okay, yeah. Sometimes, you know, we develop it for a lot of different reasons. In many cases, it's the internalized voice of somebody who was significant to us when we were younger, parents or teachers or whatever, that we've sort of internalized over time. You know, you're never going to amount to anything, you're stupid, you're slow, whatever it is. You hear it enough times and you do start to believe it. Another thing, kind of funny thing that happens, well, it's not funny at all, it's unusual and it's painful, is that let's just say you're, you know, 5 years old and your mother tells you, you know, you're so stupid, you're just not going to amount to anything. I don't know, you know, what I ever thought, you know, blah, blah, blah. When you're 5 or 4 or 3, you need that parent most often, right, to survive. You can't live on your own when you're 5 years old, right? So you're not in a position to say, well, you know, Mom, I don't think that's true. Actually, I think, let me show you the T chart that says, you know, actually, I've got these things going for me. The best thing, because you need to survive, the smartest thing you can do for survival is to agree with them, is to bond and to take that in, because that will keep you alive. So this really comes down to like survival kind of evolutionary kinds of issues, because we are, you know, we need to be connected to each other. And if what we have to do to be connected is to agree with a parent who says that we're no good, we will do that. And it'll get us through that situation, but then it'll haunt us later. So we teach this whole mindful self-compassion program in 8 weeks, and I'm trying to do it in like, you know, not very much time. But I do want to give you a practice of self-compassion that you can use. So we're going to experiment just a little bit. When we ended that other practice, when I had you doing the different hand gestures, we put our hands on our heart. I'm just going to invite you, if you want to set things down for a moment, to just return to that for a moment and just notice what is here. You don't have to call anything out. Just notice your experience of placing your hand on your heart in this kind and gentle way. And I would be willing to bet money that there are some of you who find this very comforting, soothing. Some of you who maybe are not really feeling much of anything. And maybe some of you who are feeling that this is a little uncomfortable, like you almost can't quite do it. Or that when you do it, it kind of stirs something uncomfortable or difficult up for you. And that's okay, that's quite common. So you might, what we're looking for is a gesture that for you conjures up this sense of self-kindness and self-compassion. So we're gonna experiment with a few other gestures. So we might take like one hand and clasp it in the other. Just in some way sort of holding your own hand for a moment. And just noticing, again, eyes open or closed, it doesn't matter, whatever's right. Whatever allows you to tune into the felt sense of the gesture. Maybe one hand rubbing the other, palms rubbing together. Maybe making a fist out of one hand and placing it on the chest with the other hand over it. This gesture was introduced to me by a New York City firefighter who was a little concerned about just two hands over the heart in the firehouse and what kind of ridicule he might experience. Maybe placing one hand on the belly and one hand on the heart. Or even placing both hands on the belly. Just gently cradling. Maybe placing one hand on the cheek. Feeling the warmth and kindness of the touch. Or both hands on the cheeks. Maybe gently stroking the forearm of one arm with the hand in the other. Now you're trying both sides, just noticing what comes up. Or maybe giving yourself, wrapping your arms around your torso and just giving yourself a little squeeze. I have a friend who calls this the Surreptitious Self Hug. So maybe just taking a moment to go back through those, see if you can find what gesture for you kind of brings up that sense of self-kindness and self-compassion. Maybe just a single hand on the heart. It might be any one of those. Just finding your soothing touch. So once you have a sense of that, we're going to move right into a little exercise, a little practice here. You don't have to do anything. You're just fine right where you are. If your eyes are open, you might close them if you're comfortable with that, or softening your gaze. Maybe if your hands are in the gesture now, maybe just returning them to your lap or to your sides. We'll come back to that gesture in a moment. So for now, see if you can call to mind a situation in your life that's difficult. Something that's causing you stress, maybe a health problem, a relationship problem, a work challenge, or maybe a friend who's having a hard time. Choose a problem in the mild to moderate range. Don't choose the most difficult problem you face right now. You can always come back to this practice later with that. We don't want to overwhelm ourselves when we're just learning this skill of self-compassion. Call the situation to mind, allowing yourself to see and hear and feel your way into the problem, the situation. Feeling your way into it to the extent that you might feel a little uneasiness in your body somewhere. Where do you feel it the most? Maybe just take note of when you call this difficult situation, a problem to mind, is there some place in your body in particular that it really stands out, where you feel it the most? Making contact with that discomfort that you feel in your body and saying to yourself, in your mind, this is a moment of suffering. This is a moment of suffering. So this is mindfulness. Other options might be that you would say, oh, this hurts, or ouch, and this is really hard. And then taking a moment to say to yourself, suffering is actually a part of living. This is that common humanity. It may take the form of something like, I'm not alone, others are just like me. We all struggle in our lives. And this is how it feels when a person struggles in this way. Now, placing your hands over your heart or in whatever soothing touch you found was most relevant and helpful to you, wherever it feels soothing, feeling the warmth and the gentle touch. May I be kind to myself. May I be kind to myself. This is the self-kindness. And you might say something to yourself like, may I give myself what I need? May I accept myself as I am? May I live in love? And if you're having any trouble finding just the right words, maybe imagining that a dear friend or a loved one was having the same problem as you. What would you say to this person, heart to heart? What message would you deliver to a dear friend? And could you offer that same message to yourself? And when you're ready, you can let go of the gesture and the practice, allowing your eyes to open. Would anybody care to share your experience of that practice? It's called the self-compassion break. Calming. Was there any particular part? There were sort of the three parts of this is a moment of suffering, suffering is a part of living, may I be kind to myself. Any particular part stood out for you? Or?
Just trying to be kind to myself.
Trying. Yeah. Any other experiences? Any struggles? Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral? Yeah.
I felt that tension in my lower back, which is where I carry stress, but I didn't realize it. When you set out on this journey with us, and I would experience that, so it was validating that when I'm experiencing back discomfort, I need to look at what's going on.
When you noticed that discomfort, was there any way that you could be kind to yourself? Any? Yeah?
I breathed into it. I've been doing yoga for 23 years, regularly, but I still have to keep practicing being kind to myself and being in the moment.
Yeah, it's a lifelong process. Yeah. So really when it comes down to the, thank you for all of your sharing. What it comes down to is actually noticing the times when we are suffering and remembering that this is a part of living, and then seeing if we might be able to be kind to ourselves. And that could take a variety of different forms. How, you talked about breathing into it. For some people, it's giving yourself some comforting or encouraging words. Some people, it's putting on the heating pad, or moving, or whatever it might be. It doesn't matter the form of it. It's just actually deciding to be kind to yourself because you're having this difficult experience. Again, it's not to get rid of the experience. We would like that to happen, but the point of the matter is to see if we could be kind to ourselves just because it's difficult. And that changes the nature of it. Is this kind of making sense? This extends into lots of areas, and we don't have all day or 8 weeks. I did want to say one more thing, and then we can maybe kind of open it up for any questions. A lot of people wonder, if this self-critic is so painful and so difficult and causes so many problems, why do we have it? Right? That's a good question, right? That yammering voice in there, like what is that all about? Any thoughts about that? Why do you have a self-critical voice? What do you think that is?
It's God's fault.
Okay, go right to the big guy. Right? Yeah.
I always say God's fault. It's his fault.
Okay.
I think there's a survival aspect to it.
Okay. Say more.
Group survival.
Group survival process. Can you say a little bit more, if you would? I'm going to kind of repeat so everyone can hear.
I'm not sure, and I'm just thinking of it.
Yeah. Okay. I think so too, and I'll say more about that in a second. Other thoughts? Yeah.
In the religion that we've been brought up.
Right. Yeah.
Catholic school guilt.
Right. There's some Jewish guilt too, so you don't have a
I know.
corner on that.
Inner tapes.
I'm sorry?
Inner tapes.
Inner tapes. So kind of replaying things that we heard when we were younger. Right. Yeah, and then but the question becomes, we have a bad experience, or we have that inner tape. Why, the question becomes, why does it keep playing? Can't we turn that damn thing off, right? Yeah. Well, if you think about it, this is where it's really interesting, and we don't have time to really go far into this, but if you think about that inner critic, when you really kind of drill down, you realize that it's actually trying to help you, and it's trying to keep you safe. So if you think about, just to you, I don't like to always just rag on parents, myself being one, I don't want to do that, but it, often this does get inherited. We do record that tape early on and we keep playing it. But in some cases, people have had parents who had meant them no good, and they were just acting out their own pain, and there was no redeeming value of that. But in most cases, parents that say these things, that do these things, typically are trying to help. It's a very ineffective way of trying to help, right? Like if it's like the the stereotypical tiger mom who, the kid comes home with a 99% on his exam, and she says, "Why didn't you get 100%? What's the matter with you? Aren't you smart enough to get 100%?" It's awful, but you see the motivation for it, right? It's the parent wants the child to do even better so that he or she will succeed and have all the things that maybe the parent didn't have or whatever. And you can extend that to most everything. We had someone one time in a course we taught with a group of men, teaching self-compassion to men, going back to this, that we have an exercise in the program where we actually have us kind of call out that inner critic and actually sort of thank it for trying to keep us safe, and then letting it kind of go its own way. And what he noticed is when he tuned into that inner critic, and this could be the case for some of you, he recognized that it was actually the voice of his father. And he kind of knew that piece, but what he didn't really realize was that he knew that he'd been angry at his father all his life. He was in his 70s, I think. He'd been angry at his father all his life. His father yelled and was just mean and nasty and everything, and that's all he could remember, and he just knew he was mean. But in this moment of sort of like saying, trying to see how, this inner critical voice was actually just trying to motivate him and keep him safe, he suddenly, in a moment, recognized that his father was scared to death. He had no idea how to be a parent. And he was just doing what he knew how to do, which was to yell to make things happen and to criticize to make things happen because he wanted his son to be okay. Now, it doesn't excuse the behavior or anything else, but for this man, he was just in tears. It was like, I've done psychotherapy with patients for years, and stuff happens in this practice in a matter of hours that takes months sometimes in psychotherapy. For him to be able to suddenly see that his father didn't mean him harm, his father was motivated out of fear that he would not be a good father, suddenly shifted everything for him and allowed him to then kind of free himself of that self-critic, because he could say, okay, yeah, thank you, self-critic. I actually want to change. I want to be better, but for very different reasons. Not because I'm no good as I am, but because, I want to take better care of myself. I want to live longer. I want to do certain things. So this is, when we start to see that inner critic is not just like some unfortunate, tumor that needs to be removed, and instead we see it as something that's trying to keep us safe. It's just doing a crappy job of it. We can sort of say, yeah, I see where you're coming from, thanks, I'll take it from here. And it's just the last piece about this is that a colleague of mine who teaches this mindful self-compassion program in New Zealand did a research study with people with diabetes. And she compared people who did treatment as usual, they went to see their doctors, I think they even went to a support group, to a group of people who went to their doctors and also took the Mindful Self-Compassion course. And then she compared how they were doing both mentally and physically at the end of the study. And she found that, not surprisingly, people who took the course reported better mood and better quality of life and things like that. But they also reported better blood glucose levels and better HbA1c levels than the people in the control group. So physiologically, they were actually better from having taken mindful self-compassion and practicing self-compassion. Now, there's nothing magic that happens, like spilling water on yourself. When you take MSc, it's not going to lower your HbA1c levels just because you take the class. But if you're a diabetic and you're more self-compassionate, you start to take better care of yourself. And you eat better, and you exercise, and you do the things you're supposed to do, and that brings those levels down. So when we can see that inner critic for what it is and thank it and kind of move on, then the possibility exists for us to treat ourselves better, to take better care of ourselves. Even around just the last thing here, I know they said the last thing was the last thing, but, for those, many of you, most of you are struggling with, this illness, this difficulty. You know what you're supposed to do, right? The doctor has said, do this, don't do that, diet, exercise, whatever, whatever they advise you to do. And, most of us do some of those things, but typically not all of them. But if we can cultivate greater self-compassion, the likelihood is that we are going to take better care of ourselves, which means that it's likely to have the best possible effect on the problem, the disorder, and the outcome is likely to be better, plus the mood is better. So hopefully I've made a little bit of a connection here around why self-compassion might play a role in having a better quality of life, better, greater wellness, relief of pain and suffering. As I said, I could go on. This plays out in interpersonal relationships quite well. It has a relationship to anger, difficult emotions, how we relate to feelings like shame. I'm not going to go there, but just suffice it to say that self-compassion has a lot of impact on a lot of different things. So there's this course, Mindful Self-Compassion, that's available in the community. You can Google it. In that handout packet on the back page, there are a lot of resources. There's a link to the Center for MSc website. There's links to the sites for Christopher Germer and Kristin Neff, information about books. And I also brought with me a copy of a newly released book called the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook. Martha's holding it up now. She's doing her Vanna White. This is our spokesmodel for today. It's a really wonderful kind of self-paced, self-help kind of workbook around moving through the Mindful Self-Compassion course that I highly recommend. I'm leaving a copy for Martha maybe to use as a door prize in the future or something like that, but I really highly recommend it if you can't get to a course. There's also, the course is also offered online as well from the Center for MSc. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions, concerns, objections. Yes?
Well, since you gave the example of the diabetes group where you saw physical changes, how about in terms of people going through cancer treatments?
Yeah, this program is pretty new, and there isn't a ton of research out yet. And I don't know of anybody doing work with cancer. I know that I worked at the Moores Cancer Center at UCSD for 4 years or so, teaching mindfulness and to some degree self-compassion. And I think what's nice about this kind of an approach is it's systemic. It's not specific to diseases or disorders. I think, like I said, with the diabetics, it was not about like some direct effect on blood levels of, you know, sugar. It was how people related to their difficulties and how they took care of themselves. And so my experience with people going through cancer treatment, for example, was that people who were, well, I should qualify it slightly. People who were kind of in the acute phase, like recently diagnosed, freaking out, trying to do everything, would come and sign up for the class because they were also like changing their diet and starting to exercise and going to some clinic in Tijuana and talking to 5 doctors, and they were trying to do everything at once. And it was kind of unfortunate because people were so intensely desperate that they couldn't do anything very well with the program. But for people who kind of got past that first phase and were either in active treatment or maybe even in remission, what I found was that people found a way to kind of grease the skids through the process, to kind of ease the process, to take the edge off of it, to kind of let go of the things. You know, it's a little bit like some of you may be familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous and the Serenity Prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It's the essence of mindfulness. So for people going through treatment, of seeing what could be let go of, what needed to be hung on to, and how to kind of hold that balance. So I saw a lot of wisdom arise in people going through that process when they were less kind of jerked around by it, and they had kind of like an evener keel, so to speak. And there are studies around mindfulness and cancer treatment that also point to like greater quality of life and things like that too.
So are places like Moores incorporating more of programs like this?
Some more than others. Sadly, not as much at Moores as I would have liked. I think physicians, fortunately, we're teaching mindfulness now in our medical school at UCSD, and many medical schools are. And that's going to be where the change starts to come, when the doctors are sort of seeing much more the mind-body connection and the relationship between these things. And it's not just, oh, that problem is in your head or it's in your body, but it's in you. You know, so that's very heartening, I think, and not to mention the fact that the physicians themselves really need this, because if you haven't noticed, it's a stressful job. but yeah, so when we're getting to the young ones, so to speak, it's really great, and we're starting to get doctors, young doctors, referring people in our system at UCSD. Not to brag about UCSD, but you know, as everybody does these days, an electronic medical record, and the doctors can refer people to our mindfulness courses just like they send you for an x-ray or someplace else. Insurance doesn't typically pay for this. We're not quite that advanced just yet, but at least doctors are knowing that if people are going through difficult circumstances, something like mindfulness and self-compassion can really make a difference. And just to kind of go to another end of the spectrum, and to kind of brag just a little bit, but our Center for Mindfulness just a couple of months ago got about a $500,000 contract to provide mindfulness and compassion training to officers of the Department of Homeland Security. So they have a couple 100,000 employees around the world, but so it's a big job and it's not that much money in the overall scheme of things. But the idea of teaching mindfulness to people in the law enforcement, first responder. Yeah, and that's an area of particular interest of mine. I work with a colleague up in Oregon who's a police officer and a mindfulness teacher who wants to really transform policing. So cool stuff. Mindfulbadge.org if you're curious about that. But we're looking forward to we'll be teaching mindfulness to Customs and Border Patrol, immigration, ICE, Coast Guard, Secret Service. There isn't really anybody who couldn't benefit from a little more mindfulness. So, yeah.
Are you working at all with the neurology department, neurological issues?
Yeah, we actually have, there's a couple of doctors at UCSD in neurology who refer patients to us quite a bit. There's a Dr. Irene Litvan is one who has actually done a lot of work in Parkinson's and other kind of like atypical movement disorders and things. So, and she's had a great appreciation for mindfulness, and so she tends to refer a lot of people. You know, the other thing is that stress. It used to be like if someone said, well, what physical problems are related to stress? And like 20 years ago, people would say, well, you know, ulcers was basically it. People don't really get ulcers anymore. That's a whole separate story as much. But now people realize stress plays a part in everything. You know, stress plays a part in most chronic pain. It plays a part of gastrointestinal problems. It plays a part in neurological problems. Because, you know, that your nervous system is your nervous system. And so if you can treat a piece of the problem, you're bound to have some effect.
I think about it because, like, if there's tremor involved, quite often that is aggravated by stress.
Right.
So therefore, if you can lower the stress, you can also lower the amount of tremor.
Right. You know, another thing that often comes up for those of us, it sounds strange, for those of us who are aging, which is all of us who are alive, right? This process we're all engaged in no matter what age we are. But if you think about something like cognitive problems, which a lot of us are concerned about, especially as we get up there, quite often memory problems, quote, memory problems and other cognitive deficits that people have when they're older stem as much from anxiety over having cognitive problems as any sort of physiological issue, you know? Because if you think about it, so when you're anxious, your brain is putting out, you know, adrenaline and other chemicals into the system, which, you know, is made for fight or flight, right? But when that's happening, that's impeding your ability to put down memories, because if you're in fight or flight, you don't need to be like registering every single moment. You need to be getting out of the way. So there's this close connection that if you're stressed, if you're, you know, you think about when you get frustrated because you can't find a word, and then you get, you know, we all do that, and the more upset we get, the harder it becomes to find the word, because we're starting to get those stress chemicals coursing through our veins, and we can't think straight. So, you know, the connection between these things is really close, which reminds me, Martha asked me about this briefly before we started. I don't know the status of it, but they may still be recruiting participants. Colleagues of mine and I are part of a huge research study here at UCSD and in Washington University in St. Louis, where we're studying mindfulness-based stress reduction in older adults, which is anybody over 65.
I was in that study.
You were in the MedX?
It's also included Exercise.
Exercise, right.
Yeah, for a year and a half I was in it.
Oh, good for you. Thank which Cassandra, you took MBSR then. Okay.
Yeah.
She's awesome. So yeah, there are 4 arms of the study. So if you sign up for the study, I'm pretty sure you can Google it. MEDEX, MEDEX. It's a big commitment, as this lady said. I mean, time-wise.
Wonderful. It was wonderful. At first I thought, oh, I'm going to do this, but it was wonderful. I'm so glad I did it.
I'm very curious because my sister has a neurological deficit in the hippocampus and it's not Alzheimer's. Anyway, as part of this studies, did they actually measure with electrodes as far as...
They do, yeah, they do. I don't know if, well, they collect a lot of data. Yeah, so they do, they did imaging. Did you go in the scanner at some point or a couple of times? They do neuropsych testing. They take blood samples. They're collecting a lot of data. And it's, just so you know, I mean, you can read about it on their website, but you're like any research study, there are different conditions you could be assigned to. So there are 4 conditions in this study that they're comparing to each other. Mindfulness, or MBSR, exercise, mindfulness plus exercise. That's for the really hardcore people. And then health education is a health education program. So you can be, you know, you don't get to choose. They randomize you to those. But it's a really extensive study of mindfulness in older adults. And it's a great opportunity to take the course for free. I mean, you have to do a lot of work. And you get paid, right. Actually, you get paid to do it. So, yeah, it's coming towards the end of the study, and I'm not sure how much more recruiting they're doing at this point, but it's worth looking into for sure. MEDEX, MEDEX.
And you said there's a website?
Yeah, I think if you Google MEDEX, you'll probably find it. I don't know the exact site offhand.
My sister's at UCLA, but I'd like to look at it a little more.
Yeah, and there's a great mindfulness program at UCLA as well, by the way. Just, I mean, it's not a research study, but there's a...
Do you know who the individual is?
No, but it's called MARC, Mindful Awareness Research Center. So if you Google MARC at UCLA, you'll find it. We're at the end of our time. I want to thank you for your time and attention. Okay.